If there was a soul drifting somewhere between survival and loss, would you recognize it? If that form made no sound, asked for nothing, just lay there, soaked, trembling, seemingly already let go, would your heart still carry enough sound to hear what all other senses had long ignored? The rain had just ended when Elias Monroe drove through the southern forest of Eastbridge. Water still trickled from the eroded hillsides, carrying the damp scent of rotting leaves, and something else, something that once lived. In the back seat, his 6-year-old daughter Lila pressed her face to the window, her eyes still as a lake after a storm. No seizures for 3 days now. But Elias knew. Silence was never a guarantee. He used to be a veterinarian before the accident took Claire, his wife, and left Lila with brain damage that could never fully heal. From then on, he stopped being a doctor. He became a father. And then Lila spoke. "Daddy, stop!" The tone in her voice made Elias hit the brakes, not because it was a command, but because something about it felt like a memory. Before he could ask, she opened the door and stepped out, making her way through the mud toward a fallen tree blocking the trail. Beneath the tree, something stirred. A scrap of wood adrift. A German shepherd, drenched, its hind leg twisted, chest rising with labored breaths. A deep, swollen mark circled its neck. Burns are still raw, spreading across its side. "He was left behind," Lila whispered, "like I was at the hospital. They didn't think he'd make it." Elias knelt, hands trembling as he reached for the mud-caked body. The dog didn't snap, didn't flinch. He simply stared at Lila, eyes holding something. Not quite pain. "Do you know what he's trying to say?" Elias asked softly. Lila nodded. "He's saying, 'Don't leave me behind again.'" The dog couldn't stand. His pulse was weak, temperature falling, blood crusted around burns that pulsed with heat. To Elias, once a trained vet, this was a critical case. Trauma, exhaustion, possibly organ failure. Part of him wanted to call for help, follow protocol. But before logic could speak, Lila had knelt beside him. "I won't leave him alone," she whispered, her trembling fingers brushing the soaked fur, as if holding on to something already slipping away. "Lila, you remember what I said, not to touch injured animals." Elias reached gently for her shoulder, but she shook her head. "Not an animal. A friend." Since the accident, Lila spoke little. But with animals, she had her own language, like a whisper not meant. To be answered, yet always heard. "You'll be okay," she murmured, her eyes locked on the dog's fractured gaze. "I was cold like that too, before the ambulance came." That made Elias pause. He remembered, too clearly. Claire was gone, and his daughter, only 3 at the time, had seized in his arms for 18 long minutes. Her tiny body had once been this cold, too. Lila placed her hand gently on the dog's head, then looked up at Elias. She didn't plead. There was only the quiet look of a child who had once wandered too far from life and refused to let anyone else do the same. "I'll call him Orion," she said, "because that's the star Mom taught me to draw." Elias didn't speak. He simply shrugged off his coat, laid it down as a cushion, and lifted the cold, broken creature in his arms, just like he once carried his daughter across the edge of loss. Up ahead, Lila waded through the mud, her raincoat flapping in the wind. But her eyes didn't look down. They looked forward, as if leading someone back into existence. The wooden cabin on the slope of Sycamore Ridge still smelled like rain. Elias laid the dog on an old cushion in his former office, a space where he once saved dozens of animals, but had locked away since Claire's passing. He didn't plan on being a doctor again. Yet his hands remembered how to prepare gauze, antibiotics, IVs, instincts that never truly fade. Orion lay still. No growl, no bark, just rapid, shallow breaths. Though feverish, leg shattered, skin scorched, his eyes still held on to something. Lila sat a meter away. She didn't touch him, didn't speak, just stayed there, like a breath waiting beside a life on the verge. "He may not make it through the night," Elias said, not as a warning, but as truth. "Deep trauma, blood loss, high fever." Lila didn't reply. She quietly reached into her pocket and pulled out a small stone, painted long ago with a heart, now faded. She placed it by Orion's paw. "He needs to know. Someone once chose him." Around 2 a.m., Orion shifted slightly. Then, to their surprise, let out a sound. Not a bark, but a breath with intent. He opened his eyes, not toward Elias, but toward Lila. She stepped forward without hesitation, laid her hand upon his head, and in that moment Elias saw something he hadn't dared hope for. Light. Flickering, fragile, but returning to his daughter's eyes. Lila whispered something, and for the first time in nearly 2 years, Elias saw his child smile. A girl once lost from the world, a dog once left behind, and between them, something that needed no words. The next morning, sunlight as thin as parchment filtered through the wooden frame, settling softly over the mattress where Orion lay. Lila sat on a folding chair beside him, legs dangling, one hand holding a tiny spoon, the other resting gently atop the gauze-wrapped form. Orion didn't eat much, but he kept his eyes open. Every time Lila spoke, the dog blinked, a silent signal between two minds that needed no language to understand one another. Elias stood at the kitchen, holding a coffee cup gone cold, unable to look away from the corner of the room. He'd seen veterans by the bedsides of wounded dogs. He'd seen children weep over missing cats. But the bond between Lila and Orion was unlike anything he'd ever known. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't dramatic. It felt destined. "I have a name for him," Lila said suddenly, without turning. Elias raised a brow. "Oh? What is it?" "Orion," she replied, her voice steady, as if she were stating a truth, not making a choice. He walked over and sat beside her. "Why Orion?" She didn't answer right away. She looked down at the dog's steady breathing, then whispered, "Because Orion is the star Mom showed me, when I was too young to remember anything else." Elias froze. He remembered that night, a winter evening when Lila was 2. Claire had carried her outside after a small seizure. The sky was cold and full of stars. Claire had pointed to a cluster that never seemed to vanish from the January sky. "Orion is the night's guardian," she'd said. "He doesn't go to sleep until you're safe." Lila couldn't possibly remember those words. Yet somehow, she had kept them. Elias gently brushed his daughter's hair aside. That simple act made her lean against his shoulder, a moment so tender no one dared breathe. The German shepherd snorted lightly and shifted, as if acknowledging the name, then settled again, as if content. "Orion," Elias echoed. "A name to guard the night." "Not every night," Lila whispered. "Just the ones when you're not sure if you'll wake up in the morning." That line, as quiet as breath, made Elias let go of the coffee cup and wrap his arm around her, pulling her close. He once lost someone he couldn't save. But maybe this time, he was just in time. Even if it was just one name. Even if it was just one breath that didn't give up. It took Orion 3 days to lift his head, 6 days to take a few wobbly steps down the short hallway between the office and the kitchen, and nearly 2 weeks to bark for the first time. Not from pain, not from hunger, but when Elias dropped, a stainless steel spoon onto the stone floor. That bark made Lila burst into laughter, a rare sound that made Elias set down his coffee without realizing. The dog's recovery was slow, but steady. like an old clock being rewound, not by machines, but by the warmth of a 6-year-old girl reading beside his cushion every morning. Orion didn't eat much, didn't sleep much, but whenever Lila sat down, he'd shift closer, resting his head gently in her tiny palm, breathing as though he'd just finished a long overnight watch. And then Elias began to notice. Something had changed. Lila still took her medication regularly, but there were no more nighttime seizures, no sudden blackouts during meals, no unexplained tumbles while stacking stones on the porch. He didn't dare say it aloud, afraid the spell might break if he named it. But the notes in his journal spoke for him. Day 4, no irregularities. Day 7, slept through the night. Day 10, eyes brighter. Lila still didn't talk much, but her face had softened, as if a noise once trapped in her head had finally faded, leaving just enough quiet to feel alive. And every time Elias wanted to whisper thanks to someone, he'd look over and find Orion sitting at the door, ears alert, eyes locked on Lila. No training, no commands, just a dog who'd once been left behind, now choosing to stay. At first, Elias thought it was a coincidence. Orion stood guard outside Lila's room one early morning, tense, ears up like he was protecting something. Minutes later, Lila collapsed. A seizure came on fast, but not severe. Orion didn't bark, didn't panic. He simply moved in, lay beside her, and rested his head on her thigh. Silent, present, close enough to catch her. The second time, Lila was coloring on the porch when Orion suddenly left his cushion, circled her 5 times, then sat heavily just behind, as if predicting where she'd fall. 30 seconds later, the convulsions began. And this time, Elias couldn't deny it. Orion had known. From then on, Elias started keeping records. Day 10, low howl 40 seconds before a mild seizure. Day 12, scratched Elias's door, eyes fixed on the hallway. Day 14, sat at the edge of the bed with no visible warning signs from Lila. No cues, no prior training. The dog simply knew. There were moments Elias felt like he wasn't the only one watching over Lila, that another presence, quieter and more attuned, was sharing the task. A creature that didn't need stethoscopes or ECGs, just one glance, one soundless shift, and it understood what was coming. And Elias, once a veterinarian, didn't know which column to write that under in a medical report. "Why do you sit next to Orion every time you feel breathless?" he asked one evening. Lila looked at him, her eyes glowing beneath the soft nightlight. "I don't feel it at first. He does. Every time I start to fade, he's already there. So I know I'm still here." Elias said nothing. He just sat on the floor beside her bed. On one side, a man who had lost his wife to a medical accident. On the other, a dog who'd been abandoned. And between them, a child learning to survive. Not through medicine, but through a being who knew exactly when to stay close. Elias returned to something he had long abandoned: textbooks, neurological data, studies on canine brainwave sensitivity. He read every night after Lila fell asleep, annotating margins with pencil beside formulas that once meant everything to him. The term canine seizure detection appeared again and again, but all studies led to the same conclusion: ongoing research, no definitive explanation. Some papers suggested that dogs could detect micro-scent changes as serotonin levels shifted before a seizure. Others speculated on bioelectromagnetic sensitivity, but all remained theoretical. No one could explain how some dogs sense seizures 60 to 90 seconds in advance, like Orion. He'd had no training, no instructor, no cues taught with bells or chemical samples. And yet, he knew when another soul was drifting from the earth. Elias pulled out his old infrared camera and mounted it in the living room corner. He recorded 72 hours of continuous footage. And then, one quiet afternoon, as Lila lay reading, he saw it. Orion stood up, turned his head, walked to her side before any symptom showed. He tapped her palm gently. She put the book down immediately, and 10 seconds later, the seizure hit. Elias froze the frame at that precise moment, Orion staring straight into Lila's eyes. No blink, no fear, just knowing. He leaned back in his chair, gaze fixed on the screen. Decades of academic learning had never taught him this. Maybe not everything needed to be proven. Maybe some things only existed when you were quiet enough to witness them. Elias didn't share it with many. He knew the look the medical world gave to things it couldn't explain. They'd nod politely, then underline anecdotal in the report. There was only one person he dared to call. Dr. Evelyn Zhao, pediatric neurologist, 32, once a student of Elias's during his teaching days at the State Veterinary College. She had sharp eyes behind round, glasses, and a habit of never interrupting, even when listening to things no one believed. They met at a cafe near the hospital. Evelyn was still the same, lab coat folded neatly over her chair, a black coffee she never drank past halfway. "I've heard," she said after he shared, "and I don't think you're imagining things." Elias looked up, not because of her answer, but because her voice held no judgment, no skepticism, just someone listening. "I know," he said slowly. "Every theory needs data. But this time, I just want to believe in what the numbers can't explain." Evelyn nodded. "There's a term in clinical studies," she said. "Sentinel intuition. A few beings, human or animal, can sense what machines cannot. The question isn't whether it's real, it's whether we have the courage to log it as data, even if we don't yet know how it works." She paused, then added, "I may not understand, Orion. But if you want to record it, I'll stand with you. You don't need to prove it to me first." Elias didn't respond, but for the first time in years, he left that cafe with something he thought he'd lost for good. Hope. Rain fell gently the night before Lila's 6th birthday. The porch roof clicked with soft, steady taps, like a clock with no hands. Inside the small beige bedroom, a moon-shaped nightlight cast a warm golden hue, painting the shadows of 2 forms against the wall. A child curled under a blanket, and a dog keeping watch along the edge of the bed. Orion was as he always was, eyes half open, ears tilted toward Lila, his body resting on its side, ready to spring up at any moment. Lila lay still for a long time. Then, softly, she spoke. "Orion." The dog didn't move. But Elias, sitting just outside in the hallway with a lukewarm cup of tea, heard something different in her voice. It wasn't like the other times. "Tomorrow I'll be 6, she said, as if sharing a secret. 6 already. People say when you're 6, you're supposed to be stronger. Do not cry when you fall." Orion breathed slowly. His gaze didn't shift from the ceiling, but Elias knew the dog was listening with some part of himself no one could see. "But what if I don't wake up tomorrow? Will you call me back?" The question floated in the rain-soaked silence. Not sad, not desperate, more like a quiet wondering, to see if the soul beside her would dare step into the deepest place in a child who knew, somewhere inside, that she could disappear at any moment. Orion shifted slightly. He didn't bark, didn't howl. He just nudged his nose against her hand. 3 times, slow and deliberate, then rested his head on the pillow beside her, like a bodyguard without a contract. Lila said nothing more. But Elias, still listening from just outside the door, wept. He had saved many lives. But this was the first time he witnessed a creature commit to saving a soul, not with words, but with presence. Just before Lila drifted to sleep, Orion stood. Not because of a noise, not because of a sudden movement. He simply did it, as if it were instinct, or perhaps a silent vow. He moved closer, lowered his head to her cheek, and licked her once, then again, and a third time, slower, gentler, as if sealing something, not to wake her, but to promise that this sleep would not become farewell. After that, Orion didn't return to the cushion in the corner of the room, as usual. He lay down right next to the bed, stretched alongside her body, shoulder brushing the mattress, tail curled toward his chest, like a quiet outline of protection. He didn't move for the rest of the night. Elias, sleepless in the next room, stepped in near 3 a.m. just to check that everything was all right. But when he saw the scene, his daughter sleeping peacefully, one hand resting loosely on Orion's thick fur, he couldn't take another step. There was something sacred in the way those two beings lay there. A child who had once brushed against death, and a dog who had once been left behind, now creating their own ritual. No one taught them. No book recorded it. But that night, it was born. And then, it repeated. The next evening, at the exact same time, Orion licked Lila's cheek 3 times again, then curled against her side. No one asked. No one prompted. By the third night, Lila turned her cheek to receive it. She didn't need an alarm clock, didn't need a bedtime story. She just needed Orion to do his part. "This is how we say goodnight," Lila whispered. And Elias understood. Though he couldn't be part of the ritual, he knew he was witnessing something more precious than any therapy he had ever studied. A bond, not born of the past, but in the future neither of them could afford to lose again. Silas Brennan didn't live in Eastbridge. He lived beyond it, literally. A wooden cabin sat isolated on the edge of the northern pine woods. No house number, no internet connection. And if you took the wrong trail to deliver a letter, you'd likely turn back halfway. Silas didn't need to be found. And he sent no one away. For the past 6 years, only 3 names knew he still existed. His lawyer, a former comrade from Afghanistan, and Claire. Brennan, his sister, who died too soon in an accident he learned about only after everything was over. Silas didn't attend the funeral, not because he didn't want to, but because he wasn't sure he was allowed. People here still remembered what happened back then. The day Silas Brennan, a former combat medic who once saved lives in the ravines of Kandahar, charged into the town hospital parking lot and broke the chief physician's ribs. No one mentioned the reason. They only remembered the sentence, 18 months in jail. His medical license was revoked. His reputation smeared as unstable. Few knew that he had witnessed a child being denied emergency care that day, simply because his mother had no insurance. The boy had collapsed from a high fever on the waiting room floor. And that same physician, who once declared every life is worth saving, turned away and signed the rejection slip. Silas didn't follow protocol. He followed instinct. Just like when he dove through gunfire to reach a wounded private, he had rushed in. This time to defend something he called righteousness without permission. After the trial, he vanished. And since then, only the wind through the forest remembered that Silas Brennan was still breathing. The old veterinary clinic in Eastbridge had long been converted into a makeshift rescue center. No signage, no white coats, just a few volunteers taking shifts to care for abandoned animals, and a hand-painted wooden sign swaying on the porch. "We don't heal. We stay." Silas never made it a habit to visit the place. But that day, a gray morning when he drove into town for gauze to treat a slow-healing burn on his wrist, he stopped the truck for reasons he couldn't name. Maybe it was a memory. Maybe the smell of iodine in the air. Or maybe it was the sight of a German shepherd lying silently beside the waiting bench, eyes fixed on a barely ajar wooden door. The dog didn't growl, didn't move, just watched, as if guarding something no one else could see. Silas sat a few steps away. He didn't intend to touch him. But then, the dog's gaze met his, and they stood still like that for nearly a minute. Silent. Director. No judgment. No fear. When a young volunteer came out, she spoke as if giving a nervous introduction. His name's Orion. A family took him in, but he's back today for a leg brace check. Is there a file? Silas asked, not sure why he was speaking. She nodded and handed him a simple chart. Intake date, notes about burns and fractures, and a single faded entry under object found on body. Metal tag. Number faded, format resembles military ID, removed to prevent infection, stored in archive. Silas froze. He had worked in K9 medical support. He knew that type of tag. It wasn't for civilian dogs, not available commercially, and the tag's code began with KX-17. That was the format used by a military working dog unit reported lost in 2015, the same unit he had once been assigned to assist before being pulled out mid-operation. He looked up again at Orion. It couldn't be. But maybe it could. Some scars don't show on skin, and some beings are born to serve, then cast aside when no budget remains to call their names. Orion kept looking at him. No bark, no stir, just waiting. That night, Silas pulled an old laptop from the wooden cabinet where he kept things he never meant to use again. The flashlight had flickered in the USB port, just like his thoughts, half believing, half hoping he was wrong. He logged into the Field Medical Division's archive, a long-forgotten clearance no one had bothered to revoke after his license was stripped. In the section titled Canine Support Units, Not Reintegrated, Silas pulled up the 2015 records, the year of a failed deployment along the northern Jordan border. The entire unit was restructured afterward, with no official debrief. There had been 5 dogs in that record. 3 were returned to the holding facility in Texas. 1 died during withdrawal. The last, VX-21, was marked missing. The only note below the name read, "Unlocated. No command response. Presumed KIA during operation. Tracking ceased due to lack of funds." VX-21 was a military code, and Orion was a name chosen by a child for a creature the world had erased with the words, "No longer of use." Silas printed the list, folded it, and slipped it into his coat pocket. His wrist still bore the old scald burn from a botched evac operation. But tonight, the real pain was elsewhere. Because if VX-21 and Orion were one and the same, this wasn't just about a lost dog. It was proof that some beings gave everything in service, only to be left out of the final report. Forgotten. Silas stood before the mirror, staring at a face aged too quickly by choices that couldn't be undone. And for the first time in years, he felt he had to return. Not to clear his name, but to return a name to a night sentinel who had never left his post, even when no one else from the unit came back. That afternoon began like so many others, damp and dim, with the smell of decaying leaves riding the breeze and distant thunder rumbling near the horizon. Elias had always felt uneasy on stormy days, not just because the old roof groaned with every gust of wind, but because of Lila, who, whenever a storm approached, grew quieter than usual. She wasn't afraid of lightning, but something in those heavy clouds seemed to make her eyes more distant, as if her body was hearing a signal the adults couldn't detect. At 3:12 p.m., Lila was drawing by the window. Orion curled at her feet, his head resting on her leg like always. At 3:17, Elias was making tea, and at 3:18... Orion leapt up, No bark, no howl, just sprang to his feet. He scratched lightly at the inside of Lila's arm, then let out a low, urgent whine, a sound that wasn't to be ignored. Elias turned, stepping quickly towards the window, but everything had already moved too fast. Lila collapsed. Her pencil hit the floor, and her small body began to seize, violently, unpredictably, more intensely than ever before. Orion immediately circled behind her, wedging his body to support her head so it wouldn't hit the wooden floor. He didn't move, didn't flinch. He just held his ground like a living shield. "Lila!" Elias rushed over, mind blank, hands fumbling through the nearest drawer for the emergency kit. But something was different this time. Lila didn't respond. No groan, no trembling at the end of the seizure like before. Only silence. Orion remained right there, eyes wide, ears pinned back, every muscle taut as if trying to hear a signal from someplace very far away. But nothing came. No sound, no answer. Just a storm still rolling in. This time not outside, but right in the center of a home that had never feared the rain. Paramedics arrived in just 8 minutes. But 8 minutes, in a house full of memories and a father kneeling on the wooden floor holding his daughter, was too long. Orion never left Lila's side. When the medics brought the stretcher in, he growled softly, not out of aggression, but as if to say, "If you take her, you'd better bring her back." Elias held Orion's collar, whispering something close to prayer. "They're only taking her to save her, son." At the county hospital, white hallways and footsteps became the soundtrack to a kind of waiting no one ever wants to learn. Lila was rushed into emergency care. EEG nodes attached, no light reflex in her eyes, no more seizures. But all readings were empty, like a song that had gone silent at its crescendo. Elias stood motionless outside the observation window, fists clenched inside the pockets of his rain-soaked coat. Orion sat pressed against his. Feet. He didn't bark, didn't cry, but his eyes never left the blurred silhouette of Lila through the glass. A tall physician in a clean white coat stepped out. "Mr. Monroe, I'm the attending doctor tonight. I'm afraid there's no detectable brain activity. The EEG is completely flat." Elias didn't understand immediately, or perhaps he didn't want to. We followed the full emergency protocol. Her heart responded briefly to the injection, but there's been no neural response. Silence. The printout from the EEG machine still lay there, coiled like a wordless indictment. Hours later, a nurse led Elias into a private room and placed a folder in front of him. A document confirming cessation of vital functions. A form offering to forward the case to forensic examination, should the family request it. And lastly, a temporary death certificate. They handed him a pen. He held it, though he couldn't remember if his hands were shaking. The name printed in block letters. Lila Claire Monroe. Elias didn't sign. He just stared at those 3 words. The name he and Claire had chosen after learning their daughter would arrive in December, the season of the most fragile lights. And now, that name lay atop a paper confirming that light had gone out. The night inside the hospital stretched longer than any other Elias had ever known. White corridors, fluorescent lights dimmer than their time. The breathing machine pulsed steadily, a biological habit sustained simply because no one yet had the strength to turn it off. Lila lay there, her eyelids still, a tiny arm wrapped in bandage from the emergency injection. Elias sat on a folding chair outside the recovery room, his head in his hands. Around his wrist, he still wore Lila's rubber hairband, the one she used to tie her hair and then wear like a little talisman. Orion didn't sit. He stood for hours at the door to the intensive care unit. At first, just watching. Then began to scratch gently. whimper quietly. And when the clock passed midnight, Orion started barking. Not loudly, not constantly, but just enough that every passerby turned, exchanging glances that asked, "There's a dog in here?" A nurse came over, gesturing for Elias to calm him down. Elias stroked Orion's head, but the dog wouldn't stop. Every 20 to 30 minutes, he'd rise again and bark once. Just once. As if answering a question no one else could hear. "He senses something," Elias whispered to the night nurse. "We understand you're grieving," she replied, gently but distantly. "But sometimes animals don't understand the truth." Elias didn't argue, because he knew the one who didn't understand the truth might be human. Orion didn't stop. From 1 a.m. to 4 a.m., he barked 4 times, each time after circling Elias once, lifting his head to stare through the observation window, then turning back and making that same sound Elias had heard every time Lila had a seizure. A warning. But this time, nothing happened. No tremors, no awakening, just a child lying still, and a dog who refused to accept that stillness as reality. Elias didn't sleep. He simply sat there, one hand resting on Orion's back, feeling each breath as if it were an act of defiance. No one expected the funeral to take place here, not in a church, not at the city cemetery, but in the garden behind the old wooden house at the end of Alder Creek Road, the place where Lila's mother once wrote children's books, and where Elias used to believe was the beginning of all gentle things. Claire loved this garden. Every spring, she'd lay a blanket in the middle of the wild grass, place infant Lila in a woven basket, and read aloud the words she'd written. She called it the first voice a child should hear, one from the heart. Now, in that very place, a white casket rested between 2 ash trees just beginning to bud. Elias hadn't chosen the color. Lila had once said that if she ever died, she wanted everything to be simple. But when asked, Elias had gone quiet. And the funeral director, an old acquaintance from town, had picked white. The color of soft endings, free of blame. Beside the casket stood a wooden table draped in linen, holding a photo of Lila laughing, taken by Elias last fall when Orion had just learned to walk on 3 legs, and Lila jokes, "We should start a circus." In one corner sat a jar of wildflowers gathered from the forest out back, and a painted stone with a heart drawn in acrylic. Elias stood motionless. He didn't cry, didn't tremble, but couldn't feel where his hands ended and the earth began, where wind touched skin or voices met ears. The rows of folding chairs lining the path were nearly full. More people came than he'd expected. Some were strangers. Some had shaken his hand after Claire's death, and then disappeared forever. But they came. And Elias, though no longer believing in ritual, nodded, quietly grateful. Orion wasn't there, not because he wasn't allowed, but because Elias wasn't sure he could bear it. The dog had stayed in the hospital room when the funeral car pulled away. He didn't eat, didn't sleep, just lay by the bed, his head resting on the empty fold of the blanket where Lila once slept. Every time Elias came near, Orion opened his eyes briefly, then turned away. Elias understood. The dog hadn't said goodbye yet, but humans can't wait forever for a hope that won't return. A wind chime jingled faintly on the porch. A song Claire had saved on her wedding day began playing from a small speaker brought by an old friend. The melody wasn't sad, but today every sound felt like something replayed from a life whose chords had been pulled. Everyone sat. The local pastor stepped forward, holding an old Bible in his hands. Elias didn't hear what he said, because he was staring down at his shoes, muddy, grass-stained, soaked with something that could have been morning rain, or the last tears he'd allowed himself to shed in front of others. No one spoke as the pastor finished his reading. He closed the Bible, bowed his head, and stepped away, as though afraid the sound of his footsteps might disturb something fragile still hanging in the air. Pain, memory, or a farewell no one had fully voiced. Elias remained standing, unmoving, like a statue forgotten in a garden where sunlight filtered through leaves and shadows stretched long over the grass. The wind touched his lapels, the corners of his eyes, and the hollow in his palm where a little hand once rested every time they walked the garden path together. The chairs along the path were full. Lila's preschool teacher sat quietly, hands folded in her lap as if holding a lesson plan no school had ever taught. An elderly neighbor clutched a frayed teddy bear, the one Lila had once tossed over the fence, saying, "He's sleepy and doesn't have a pillow." A boy from the neighborhood, who used to dig in the dirt with her, held a pebble painted with a watercolor angel. He said he would send her up high so she could see the whole town from above. None of them spoke loudly. None cried out. But in the silence, Elias felt the entire town holding its breath, so the little girl wouldn't be afraid on her way out. Someone placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. He didn't turn. Not because he didn't want to know who it was, but because if he did, one glance might shatter what little remained standing inside. An old friend placed a small notebook beside Lila's photo. Inside were scribbled notes from her classmates, some misspelled words, some just drew flowers, but each started the same. "You're still our friend." Elias bowed his head slightly, but his eyes stayed dry. There is a kind of pain that needs no tears. It just sits there, like an uninvited guest no one dares to send away. The sky was pale gray. The wind carried the scent of ash blossoms and damp soil. Everything felt adjusted to a softer volume, just enough so no memory would fall through the cracks of ordinary sound. A small blue ribbon, the color Lila once said looked like cold wind, had been tied to the corner of the casket. Elias didn't know who tied it, but it fluttered gently, like a tiny flag made for a very small warrior. No eulogy was read. Elias had written nothing. He tried once. But sitting before the blank page, he realized there were no words for a being who had existed so completely, and then simply did not. So he just stood there, silent. Because somewhere deep within, he knew, if there's any place on earth where language is no longer needed, it is here. Now, where everyone had already said enough, just by showing up. The County K-9 facility was tucked behind the police precinct, at the end of the road that led up into the hills. Steel double doors, secure locks, fingerprint scanners, surveillance cameras, and a clearly posted sign. No entry after 10 p.m., no animal contact without authorization. But no one had put up a sign that dogs could read. Orion was held there, by protocol, under supervision of companion animal after caregiver loss. That was how they phrased it, as if the bond between him and Lila had been one of ownership. At first, the dog didn't react. He lay still in the kennel nearest the window, his gaze fixed on the courtyard beyond, where yellow light caught streaks of rain. He didn't howl, didn't bark, didn't eat. The night shift staff thought it was normal. A grieving dog lost his kid. But around midnight, a sharp metallic screech tore through the quiet. The first door, a thick wooden one separating the kennels from the corridor, swung open with its hinges bent clean out of place. Orion had slammed into it with full force, again and again, without pause. Next came the steel door, locked by code. The camera footage showed it. Orion didn't run wild, didn't panic. He moved down the hallway as if he knew every step, every turn. When he reached the main entrance, he stopped, scratched 3 times, let out a deep, low cry. Not a plea. A signal. No one answered. So he jumped. Straight at the lock, then again, and again. By the fourth strike, the door dented. The hinge gave way, and the door burst open as though what had held it back wasn't steel at all, but the last restraint of a soul running out of patience. The K9 unit went on alert immediately, but by the time they arrived, Orion was gone. All that remained was a smear of blood on the doorframe, a leash snapped clean where the tension had peaked, and a still broken night, now stirred, because one guardian had returned to his post, regardless of any human rule. Officer Nate Ellison was on duty that night. He wasn't a stranger to Orion. One of the few officers who had worked in the K9 assisted pediatric therapy program, Nate knew Lila, and the way that dog had never once taken his eyes off her. So when the alarm rang out, he was the first to reach the kennels. And when he saw Orion charging toward the exit, Nate stepped in. Not with force, just one firm command. Stay. But Orion didn't stop. He didn't bite, didn't resist. He simply crashed past, shoulder slamming Nate hard enough to send him into the wall. A dry crack snapped through Nate's left wrist. Damn it, he muttered, gripping the swelling joint. But instead of radioing for backup, he watched Orion disappear into the dark, running with the pace of something that didn't know exhaustion. And at that moment, Nate didn't see a dog on the run. He saw a soldier, returning to post. A being who knew exactly where he was needed, and couldn't allow the one he protected to be lowered into the earth without standing guard one last time. Nate pulled out his keys. No report, no protocol, just a scribbled note taped to the radio console. Do not pursue. I believe he still has work to do. Then he started the patrol car, turned off the GPS, and drove in the only direction Orion might have taken. Toward the hill behind the Monroe house, where the ash garden waited. And a white casket lay beneath the overcast sky, waiting for the sun to pass its highest point. The screech of tires on gravel made every head turn. A patrol car skidded to a halt at the edge of the garden. The door swung open. No explanation, no warning. And then, before anyone could ask, Orion leapt out. No leash, no handler, no muzzle. Just a body of fur, charging through the crowd with a stride no one dared to stop. Elias shot to his feet, too late to speak, too stunned to move. And then, the unthinkable happened. Orion jumped straight into the white casket. Everything froze, as if time itself had been gripped by the throat. No one spoke. No clicking cameras, no whispers, only wind and a dog standing still, all four legs trembling with strain and sheer effort to remain still. No barking, no howling, no scratching, no pushing, just guarding. Orion slowly lowered his body, folding his legs like it was a ritual. He lay down, head slightly, raised, eyes wide, fixed toward the line of trees where the sunlight was beginning to retreat. Not the gaze of a grieving animal, but the gaze of a sentinel, still on duty. Elias felt a jolt in his chest. The entire garden held its breath. A woman reached out to pull her son close, but stopped, her hand settling gently on the boy's shoulder instead. An elderly man removed his glasses, wiped them with the edge of his shirt, but didn't put them back on. Orion lay there as if someone had ordered, "Do not let this soul pass alone." He didn't ask. He didn't seek permission. He simply did what hearts too full for words always do for each other. Stayed. Until the end. And in that instant, before anyone could invent a polite reason to stop him, the funeral ceremony no longer belonged to the humans. Orion lay still, not moving, yet every part of his body is tight with purpose, his legs pressed against the casket, his head tilted slightly, ears upright, as if listening to something no one else could hear. No one understood. They only saw a dog on a cold white box and thought it was grief. loyalty taken to its last breath. Only one man, standing at the edge of the garden, suddenly froze. Silas Brennan. He had arrived late, meant only to observe from a distance, unnoticed. But the moment his eyes locked onto Orion, and that posture, everything in him shifted. Side-lying stance, neck straight, ears raised, body aligned with the point of contact. This wasn't mourning, it was a battlefield medical alert. Silas had taught K-9 emergency response. He had lived long enough among helicopters and hot blood to recognize it immediately. Orion wasn't guarding a corpse. He was trying to save someone still alive. "Don't touch him!" Silas shouted, voice booming through the garden, startling the guests. Heads turned. Elias looked up, as if truly seeing the man standing beneath the ash tree for the first time. Silas ran forward, pulling from his coat pocket a folded document, the VX-21 unit report. But he didn't need it. What he had to say fit into one single sentence. He's signaling. This is a residual internal response alert. It's not over. No one closes that casket. A ripple of silence spread across the lawn. Orion, as if given permission, began to whine. A deep, dragging sound from his throat, low and tense, almost identical to the warning noise he'd made before each of Lila's seizures. Elias stepped forward, slowly, shaking, and for the first time since Claire's death, he spoke 3 words he hadn't believed he could say again. "Stop. Right now." Silence. Not just within Elias, but in the entire garden, where dozens had come to say their final goodbye. A few turned, assuming Elias was speaking to Silas, the man who had just broken into the funeral with the force of someone who had forgotten how to be quiet. But no. Elias was staring straight at the casket, at Orion. And on the way, the dog refused to take his eyes off the white wood. Orion was whining now, constantly, not howling, not barking, but the low sound vibrated like every nerve in his body was trying to reach someone still standing on the thin line between staying and leaving. A woman whispered, "What is this?" A man shook his head. "It can't be." Then the murders began. He's lost control. This is the girl's funeral. You can't dishonor the dead like this. A dog doesn't get to decide death. Elias heard all of it, like a drizzle soaking through the fabric of mourning and into the skin. But he didn't move, because the only sound he truly heard was Orion's low whine and the feeling in his chest. The same one he'd felt 18 minutes the day he held Lila in his arms after Claire died. A feeling that said, "She hasn't gone yet." He stepped forward. The pastor hesitated, gripping his Bible, voice tightening. "Mr. Monroe, we're all grieving. Please don't let confusion become trauma for those still here." Elias nodded. "Yes, we are grieving. But if I stand here knowing there is a 1 in 1,000 chance my daughter is still alive and I stay silent, then I'm no longer her father. I'm just someone pretending to bury her on time." No one responded. Only Silas, still unmoving like a living monument in the garden, spoke slowly. "That dog is a soldier. He served in combat zones. And that position he's in, it's a frontline medical alert posture. It does not happen without a signal." The pastor lowered his head. He neither nodded nor objected. Elias turned to the funeral director, a man in his 50s, hand still resting on the casket latch, stunned. "You're a father," Elias said, not loud, but clear. "If your son were in there and the creature your son trusted most didn't accept what was happening, could you keep it shut?" No one answered. And in that exact moment, as Elias reached out and touched the bronze latch, the wood cold beneath his trembling fingers, Orion let out a cry, not in pain, not in anger, but I like permission, as if that sound meant, now, open it. Elias turned the latch, lifted the lid, and the whole garden stopped breathing. The casket creaked open slowly, the hinges groaning through an air thick as winter drapery. A few people flinched. Some turned away. One covered a child's eyes. Another grabbed a hand, not from cold, but from a fear colder than anything wind could carry. "What are you doing, Elias?" A gray-haired woman rose from the front row, voice trembling. "She's been pronounced dead. This is a funeral." "No one has the right to do this," an older man shouted. "This isn't a place for delusion. That's your daughter's body, Elias." "It's not a body," Elias replied, voice hoarse but steady. "It's my daughter." A ripple passed through the crowd. The young pastor rushed forward, an alarm on his face. "Mr. Monroe, please, be calm. We understand your grief, but this could harm people further." "Harm?" Elias turned, eyes red but dry. "Harm is signing a piece of paper because someone tells you your daughter's heart stopped, without hearing her voice first. You call that closure. I call it an unanswered question." Orion had now climbed onto the edge of the casket, sitting upright like a living statue. Ears sharp, eyes locked on the silent face of the girl, still unmoving, but not as cold as death usually is. "What are we doing?" a young woman whispered through tears. "We came to say goodbye. And now we're witnessing what?" Another voice, older, rough and sharp, cut through. Silas. He stepped forward, posture solid, gaze slicing through the confused and angry faces. "Has anyone here served on a battlefield?" he asked, voice low but heavy as stone. "Has anyone watched a K9 alert while machines said there was nothing left? I have, and the person that dog warned about lived." A man near the garden gate, wearing a veteran's jacket, nodded slowly. "I've seen it too," he said. "Once. We almost buried a brother. If it hadn't been for that dog." No one added to it. Orion sat perfectly still, body taut, eyes blazing into Lila, as if 1 second of looking away would mean losing something forever. A woman in black stepped forward, her eyes ringed and sunken, her voice cracked. "I lost a child once. You know how it feels to hope when it's false? It kills you twice, Elias." "I know," Elias whispered. "But if I bury my daughter while she's still alive, that's not pain. That's a sin I'll never wash away." That line tore through the air like a blade. A man began to cry. A woman held her husband's hand, silently shaking her head. "What if she still dies?" someone asked. "What if this only prolongs suffering?" Elias turned, his face no longer defiant, just weary, and still holding on. "Then, at least I'll have stayed by her until the end. Not the first one to give up." And then, as if in response, Orion let out a small whine. This time no one questioned it. Silas stepped closer. "He's hearing something we can't," he said softly. "And I believe we need to do the one thing no one has dared. Wait." A little girl, one of Lila's classmates, stepped forward with a broken-colored pencil in hand. Quietly, she placed it on the white cloth covering Lila's chest. Her small hand trembled, but her eyes didn't blink. "This was hers," she whispered. "I think—" She didn't finish her drawing. The silence was no longer hesitation. It had become something else, like the hush that falls when the noise of life fades just enough to let something fragile and real be heard. Elias looked down at his daughter's hand. Then a single finger moved. So slight, so slow, but it moved. Orion whined again, louder this time. A woman gasped, A man dropped into his chair, eyes wide, because the impossible had just happened when there were no words left to say. Silas stepped forward, pressed 2 fingers to Lila's wrist. He closed his eyes, counting. Not with just his training, but with his whole heart. When he opened them, he nodded once. Pulse is weak, but it's there. Elias dropped to his knees, grasped his daughter's hand. Lila, I'm here. No answer, but her small fingers squeezed back, not strong, but strong enough to shatter doubt, reason, and every definition of what it means to let go. A nurse nearby began to cry. The man who had shouted earlier covered his face with both hands. Elias didn't look at anyone. He only lowered his head to his daughter's hand and whispered through trembling breath, "You heard me. I know. You heard me." And to seal it all, Orion howled, one long rising call that filled the garden, echoing like it was summoning a soul back to where it belonged. No one said a word, because sometimes life doesn't need to be proven. It only needs to be waited for. Elias remained kneeling beside the casket, his hand wrapped tightly around a hand that was still warm, still soft, still responding. At that moment, time stopped, or if it moved at all, it was rewinding something that had already been signed. Silas was the first to rise. He pulled out his phone, calling the county emergency center. His voice had no more fury in it, only the calm cadence of a battlefield medic. Resuscitation in progress. Female, age 6, showing signs of life after being declared deceased. Location, 143 Alder Creek Road, requesting medevac, urgent. People began to move, not out of shock, but instinct, clearing a path, finding a landing spot, gathering supplies. No one gave orders. Everyone simply acted, not from duty, but from something deeper, a need to redeem. Orion had jumped inside the casket now. No one dared stop him. He curled at Lila's feet, head resting gently across her chest. Not weighing her down, not interfering. Just enough to connect. His eyes half closed, no longer sharp with tension. This was the gaze of someone who had completed his mission and was ready to guard it again. Elias saw it and said nothing. He didn't call him down. He didn't step forward. He only nodded, as if to say that if Lila had wandered far, Orion had been the only one brave enough to follow her to the edge and call her home. A gust whistled through the distant trees. The chop of helicopter blades grew louder overhead, folding into the wind and the unsteady breath of people who thought they had said goodbye. The helicopter descended into the clearing not 30 meters from the garden. Its rotors sent linens flying, scattered funeral cards, and toppled chairs, as if the old ceremony itself had bowed out, making way for the return of life. The doctor was the first to step out, a slim woman moving with purpose. She walked straight to Elias. "The patient?" she asked. Elias pointed to the casket. His voice cracked, but was firm. "My daughter." The doctor looked in, a pale girl but with a pulse, slight twitches in her fingertips, and beside her, a German shepherd lying still, his head resting gently across her ribs, eyes unblinking. The nurse stepped forward, but the doctor held up her hand. She knelt beside the dog. "We're taking her now. You can stay or come, but don't leave her." Orion blinked once, then rose. Slowly, carefully, like a ceremonial passing of the watch. Lila was lifted onto the soft stretcher, IV lines secured, heart monitor placed. The heart still beats, slow, but there. And no one dared call it an illusion now. Elias climbed aboard the helicopter. But before the doors closed, he looked back. Orion stood beneath the ash trees, watching. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. He simply stood, still as the forest, witnessing the return of a soul to the world. The rotors lifted. The helicopter rose, carrying dust, petals, and the eyes of everyone in town. They didn't walk away, not to wait for more, but to remember that once, in this place, a dog called a child back from the edge of death. And right there, at the place where the casket had once closed, Orion walked in. No one stopped him. No one dared. He lay down. Among fading flowers, among pine-scented wood, among farewell notes, no one dared speak again. No one knew exactly why, but they watched as he closed his eyes. As if, now that the world had heard the signal, he was finally allowed to sleep. No one understood why. They only saw him close his eyes. As if, once the world had heard the signal, he was finally allowed to sleep. The medevac helicopter left Eastbridge's sky at 4:38 p.m., carrying a 6-year-old girl with fragile signs of life, and a father with no tears left. Inside the white cabin, medical equipment filled the silence with low warning tones. Each beep was a thread holding on. Each machine-aided breath, a quiet note begging her to stay. Elias sat beside the stretcher, unmoving. He only reached now and then to lightly touch Lila's knee, as if letting go for even a moment might allow her to fall back into a place where he had no authority to follow. The flight doctor, Dr. Mirren, a veteran of over 20 years in aerial emergency medicine, glanced at Elias a few times as though wanting to speak. But she stayed quiet. She had seen miracles before, but never one triggered by a dog's eyes. Over 2 hours later, Lila arrived at St. Harlow's Pediatric Neurology Intensive Care Unit. This was a place where most families wouldn't even dream of entering without special insurance or national referral programs. But this time, due to the exceptional circumstances, regional medical appeals, and the emergency protocol itself, the hospital granted an emergency override admission. She was placed in room 804, the critical neuromonitoring zone. 2 nurses reattached full arrays of brainwave sensors, blood flow monitors, oxygen levels, blood pressure, and neural reflex trackers. Elias was led to the hallway, a spotless white space. No blood smell, no harsh disinfectant. Only the sterile scent of glass and cold steel. He sat in a wall-mounted chair, eyes locked on the double-pane soundproof window. Lila lay inside, small and still beneath a halo of glowing instruments. Footsteps. Doctor. Ariane Shu, the lead neurologist, approached. An Asian woman in her early 40s, thin and reserved, with the dry edge of someone who moved daily along the border of life and death. She held the file. Her eyes were not cold, but unflinching. "Mr. Monroe," she began, taking the seat across from him, "we've reviewed all pre-hospital data. Lila's case is extremely complex. She was declared clinically dead based on flat EEG, no reflexes, and a complete neurological shutdown for over 20 minutes. The return of physical response is unusual." Elias said nothing. "The latest EEG shows extremely faint activity, but present. Some slow response to light. However, we cannot yet confirm the depth of conscious recovery." "Prognosis?" Elias asked, his voice emerging like a sound from deep bone. Dr. Shu hesitated, then delivered it in the way only those who've known pain could. "Severe. Potential for long-term vegetative state. Possibility of awakening with permanent damage, or possibly no further progress." "But," Elias looked through the glass, "it has begun." "Yes," she nodded, "and we will follow it to the end." Silence returned. Only the small overhead lamp in Lila's room remained on, a circular bulb casting soft yellow light, switched on at dusk by nurses to simulate natural sunset for patients in deep coma. From a distance, it didn't look like hospital equipment. It looked like a single candle, as if someone had lit it, so that if any soul were searching for its way back, it might find the light. Elias leaned his head against the wall, eyes closed, hand resting on his knee as if Orion still lay somewhere at his feet, guarding each breath. And deep down, he believed that light was still seen, whether from very far or very near, not warm enough yet to open her eyes, but enough not to leave. Still there, a single light in a white room, waiting. The next morning, the first clinical conference was held on the 6th floor, where neurologists, intensivists, and psychological care specialists gathered to review exceptional cases. Lila Monroe's name was at the top of the list. Red underline. Unexpected resuscitation. Positive weak EEG. Dr. Ariane Shu chaired the session. She sat at the center of the table, hands on the file printed in triplicate, eyes focused nowhere, but her presence froze the entire room. The first to speak was Dr. Quentin, a veteran in acute brain trauma. With all due respect to the preliminary neurological activity, I still believe this case should not proceed with full intervention. EEG is weak, light reflex sluggish, no voluntary movement, no pain response. I'm not advocating abandonment. I'm suggesting palliative focus. Palliative care, a young resident repeated, voice trembling, as in the end-of-line approach? As in not imposing unrealistic hope on a patient with no prospect of regaining full consciousness, Quentin replied. He didn't sound cruel, but the clinical chill in his tone thinned the air in the room. A hand rose. Dr. Linden, young, from neurocritical care. His face still bore the disbelief from witnessing Lila's arrival. But we're looking at a child whose heart had stopped and came back. EEG isn't flat. There are motor reflexes. She reacted to the sound. I can't call that hopeless. That's not hope, Quentin said. That's spontaneous peripheral signal drift, biologic fringe activity, and if we sustain it with machines, we're adding pain not to the patient, but to her family. Do you have a daughter, doctor? Quentin? Linden asked. Quiet. Clear. The room froze. The real question, Dr. Shu intervened, is the boundary between persistence and cruelty. This isn't about left or right. It's about the ethics of continuing or stopping. An older doctor sighed. I once witnessed a child awaken after 10 days of diagnosed vegetative state. No one believed, but the parents said, as long as she breathes, we'll read to her each night. And on day 11, she moved her toe. Lila moved her hand, Linden said, and reacted to her father's voice. We can't build a protocol on miracles, Quentin said. Perhaps not, Shu murmured, but we also can't throw away a chance just because it doesn't fit the chart. Outside the meeting, Elias remained seated exactly where he'd been the night before. He didn't know what was being said inside. But instinct, the same instinct that had made him open a coffin, told him his daughter's life was once again being negotiated on paper. He stood, walked to the head nurse's station. I'd like permission to read to my daughter each night, he said calmly, like a whisper smoothed over a stone. The nurse blinked. We're not certain she can hear. That's fine, Elias said, as long as I'm allowed to speak. Later, in the white room, under the same round lamp still glowing since dusk, Elias opened the folded picture book he used to read before Lila's seizures. The story goes, a little fox got lost from its den, he whispered. It wandered through snow, through forest, through black night, and each time it stopped, it heard footsteps beside it, not wind nor wolves, but a dog walking with it. He paused. Lila didn't move, but the light still glowed. His voice still spoke, and miracles didn't always show themselves immediately. Sometimes they only needed to be repeated, steadily, like a promise, like a breath, waiting. Orion was brought to the Special Care Wing's entry on a soft lead leash after 3 days waiting quietly outside the hospital corridor. Elias walked beside him. Neither led the other. They simply moved together. Through the glass of room 804, Lila still lay, unmoving, surrounded by tubes, sensors, and flickering green monitors. The pale gold light still shone. Not warm, not cold, but the only thing in the room that didn't beep, didn't blink. The only thing that waited. The charge nurse, a woman in her 50s with thick glasses and a firm voice, leaned down to unclip the leash. He's allowed inside, but no climbing on the bed, no touching equipment, and 30 minutes max. Elias nodded, said nothing. Orion didn't wait. He stepped through the automatic door, moved straight to Lila's bedside, and sat. No barking, no tail wag, no licking. Just watched. Watched like he had been here before, in some other place like this, where small arms no longer held and voices stopped mid-sentence, where people usually arrived once but never returned. This time Elias didn't follow. He stood at the door, and others, nurses, interns, the shift doctor, stood too, like they were all witnessing a ritual no one had been taught. About 10 minutes passed. The monitors didn't show any notable change. Then, suddenly, Orion let out a short, low growl. Not loud, not urgent, but to Elias it sliced through his spine, because he had heard it once before, when Orion stood atop his daughter's casket. "What's happening?" Elias asked, not to anyone in particular. A nurse rushed to the monitor, checked stats. "Stable," she murmured. "Heart rate 83. BP 94/60. O2 at 97. Nothing unusual." But Orion didn't move. He stood close to the bed, neck slightly stretched toward the left, the side where the EEG sensor was placed, his tail still, eyes tense, mouth slightly parted, as if waiting for someone to reply. 3 minutes later, the ECG remained steady, but the EEG monitor began to flicker. No alarm, just brief losses of signal. Then recovery, then lose again. An unstable pattern, known from rare cases involving deep temporal microvascular spasms, is difficult to detect without constant second-by-second observation. This time, Dr. Linden was already in the hallway. He entered quickly after being told the alert came from a service dog. When he entered, Orion had not moved. His eyes locked on an invisible point between Lila's brows, where an old bruise had faded a week ago. "Log the timestamp," Linden ordered. "Cross-check with EEG drift. I want exact seconds on when the dog reacted." 17 seconds. That was the delay between Orion's alert and the first EEG spike. In neurocritical care, 17 seconds is an eternity. At 1:27 p.m., the attending physician added a special note to Lila's daily log, marked with a red asterisk. Orion entered a designated list of biological sentinel markers. Not a machine, not a human, but a living monitor. From that day on, Orion was issued an ID badge, ORK9 Special Watch, and he returned. No commands, no schedules. Every morning at 7, every afternoon at 2, every evening at 9, he walked into room 804. Same path, same stop, same posture, head facing the child who had not yet woken, eyes searching, as if trying to remember something only they had ever shared. No one knew what Orion could feel. But everyone saw this. Orion knew when Lila changed, and no machine could register that. One night, when the hospital dimmed the halls for quiet hours, Elias sat alone by the glass. Orion had been in the room for over 40 minutes, well past the allowed limit. No one said anything, because at minute 38 he raised his head and growled again, but this time it was softer, like breath. And then Lila's finger twitched, lightly. Once. Not enough to call it awakening, but enough for the monitor to record non-reflexive motor movement. Enough for Elias, after all the waiting, to whisper, barely audible, "You heard me, didn't you?" Orion didn't reply. He didn't need to, because the answer was in the light, in the waveform, in the soul slowly returning. Quiet, slow, and met by eyes that never left their post. A night watchman? No white coat? Only a promise. That this girl would never be left behind. Not again. "Orion." The voice was raspy, trembling, thin as a thread just pulled through the eye of a needle, yet strong enough to pierce through the entire silence of the white room. Elias choked on his breath. He didn't know when the tears had started. He only knew that the hand gripping the edge of the bed had gone completely numb. On the EEG screen, a new wave rose, uneven, faint, but undeniably intentional. This was no longer a biological reflex, it was a signal. Orion, still lying still, moved only his ears. Then, slowly, he stood. Each step is deliberate, as if part of a ritual. No jumping, no barking, no wagging. He simply stepped closer, lowered his head, and gently placed his muzzle on the back of Lila's hand. And Lila, with a movement so slow it defied belief, shifted her finger, brushing lightly against the warm fur. A touch, unsteady, weak, but real. "Oh my God," the head nurse whispered. She stood frozen behind the glass, the patient chart still untouched in her hands. Elias turned, barely able to speak. "Get Dr. Shu and Linden, right now." Within 2 minutes, all three arrived, 2 doctors and a senior neurotechnician. No one asked questions. No one demanded explanations. Every eye fixed on the 6-year-old girl who, just a week ago, had been declared dead. "Lila," Dr. Linden said gently, leaning in with a pen light. "Can you hear me?" She blinked once, this time clearly. A reaction. Toward the light. No seizure. Dr. Chu gave the slightest nod, her gaze never leaving the child. "She's passed out of a deep coma. The chance of regaining active consciousness is very high." Elias let out a noise, something between a gasp and a laugh. "Hi? You mean she'll wake up? We need to monitor, but from now on, we no longer say if," she said. "We say when." Lila blinked again. Orion had not moved. He stood by her side, eyes locked on her face as if cataloging every sign, every flicker, every thread of memory being rewoven. "Orion," Lila said again. This time, clearer. Still only a whisper, but real. "You know who he is?" Elias asked, trying to steady his voice. She turned to him, looked for a long moment, then nodded softly. "When I was sleeping, I heard him. He didn't make a sound, but I knew he was there." Orion lay down at last, slowly, as if what he needed was now complete. Not with joy, not with relief, but something deeper, the quiet confirmation of a vow kept, a promise fulfilled, even if no one had ever heard it spoken. Outside, snow still fell. White light glimmered across the frosted glass, settling on the sill like the dust of time. Inside, the machines still hummed, but the rhythm had changed. A pulse. Steady. alive. Elias sat beside the bed, took his daughter's hand in his. The other hand rested gently on Orion's back. "Thank you," he whispered. "Not for saving Lila, but for not letting any of us, even me, believe she was already gone." Orion gave no reply. He didn't need to, because today, beneath the season's first snowfall and the faint warmth of the white room, a heart had opened its eyes. And for the first time, after breathing only through machines and surviving only on the hopes of others, Lila spoke a name. Not to call for help, not to resist, but to return, fully, once more, with Orion, and with her own heart. News that Lila Monroe had opened her eyes spread faster than any official medical bulletin ever released across the Northeast. But no one spoke of it as a recovery case. They called it a testimony of life, of patience, of something all the machines, from electrodes to charts, had once overlooked. Instinct. 3 days later, a line of people formed outside St. Harlow Hospital. No one asked to visit. They came to leave notes, flowers, or simply a small piece of paper with a childlike scrawl. "You're the reason I didn't give up," or "Thank you for coming back." Lila was still weak. Doctors only allowed a few minutes of conversation each day. But she smiled, a faint smile, her cheeks still pale from lack of blood, but no longer empty of light. And every time she smiled, she looked toward Orion first, as if this joy was a gift she had to share, with the one who never left her side in the long sleep. At the same time, hundreds of kilometers away, a federal ethics panel was convened. The emergency session didn't name the patient. It listed only the case code, EEEG-null, false death declaration. Emergency overturn. At the center of the review stood Dr. Lowell, head of emergency response at Riverfield Hospital, the one who had signed Lila's death certificate without a second clinical confirmation. "I followed protocol," he said. His voice wasn't angry. I was confused. "I followed every step. No vital signs. Flat EEG. No reflexes. That fits the academic definition of death." One council member, eyes fixed on the provisional analysis, asked, "Did you take into account the behavior of the dog at the time?" Dr. Lowell hesitated. "I'll ask again. At that time, did the dog display any signs of alertness?" "Yes," he admitted with a slow nod. "And you dismissed it as emotional behavior with no medical value?" "Yes, there is no credible literature that defines a dog as a biological indicator." The answer was not technically wrong, but it left the room in a different kind of silence. Not the kind born from respect, but from the recognition that some things humans overlook not because they don't see them, but because they lack the humility to believe. An internal investigation expanded, not just into Dr. Lowell's judgment, but into the entire regional presumed death procedure used in emergency response units. At the same time, a petition of nearly 40,000 signatures surfaced across medical networks, calling for a redefinition of non-instrumental resuscitation and an expansion of early detection criteria to include medically supported service animals. Back in East Bridge, the town once thought to be remembered only for a tragic funeral, something shifted, not through banners, not through speeches, but in small, steady acts, the way snow falls on a quiet night. A cafe framed a photo of Orion at the entrance, with a sign beneath it. Night Watch doesn't need a name. The local bookstore reprinted Lila's favorite picture book with a new dedication, for those who know how to wait. Her old preschool, where children once wrote goodbye letters, rehung the colorful paper flags Lila had strung up on her last day before the greatest seizure of her life. As for Elias, he didn't speak much. He didn't need to, because now, every time he stepped out of the hospital, he met the eyes of people who had once turned away, who once shook their heads, who told him not to cling to miracles. Now they didn't apologize. They didn't have to. They simply placed a hand over their heart and bowed their heads. A silent confession that sometimes miracles don't come to fix what's wrong. They come to remind us that one unwavering heart can change an entire system. 6 weeks after Lila opened her eyes, a special document arrived for Elias Monroe. It was not from the hospital, nor from the mayor's office. It came from the federal court of the region. The message was only 3 pages long, but attached was a re-examination file nearly 300 pages thick, marked with red ink. Urgent Special Review. At the bottom of the first page, one line was printed in bold. Based on new data concerning the incident at Riverfield Hospital and the testimony involving extraordinary medical recovery, we declare Silas Brennan is fully exonerated. His record is cleared. His honor was restored. He is no longer under supervision. Alongside it was an invitation. We respectfully invite Mr. Brennan to assume the role of Director, Rescue Dog Training Program, National Companion Recovery Network, Pilot Location, Eastbridge. Elias read that line over and over again. Each time, he glanced toward the rehab room where Lila was working through physical therapy with Orion. The dog rested his chin on her foot, eyes half closed, as if he had always belonged there. Elias walked to the small cabin on the edge of the forest, where Silas had lived in solitude for years. The old man was still sitting on the wooden step, fixing an old harness. When Elias held out the envelope, Silas didn't take it right away. "What is it?" he asked without looking up. "It's what you should have received years ago," Elias replied, his voice stripped of the calm he usually wore. Silas opened the letter, read it once, folded it back, said nothing. "They want you to lead a national program," Elias continued, "to retrain the forgotten dogs, so they can become the ones who call the souls home." Silas let out a small laugh, a sound that hadn't been heard in many seasons. "I've seen too many places where dogs are forced to serve humans," he said. "Never have I seen one where someone asked the opposite. What if these creatures carry a memory they were never allowed to tell?" "Then it's time to listen," Elias said, "not with microphones, but with eyes." 3 months later, the first center of the Backline Companion Recovery Program opened just outside Eastbridge. There were no banners, no pictures of founders, only a hand-carved wooden sign. "Here, the ones who were left behind will learn how to stay." Silas was the only one authorized for direct training and coordination, but he didn't work alone. The first partner he recruited was a man who had lost his wife, almost lost his child, and once knelt beside a coffin he thought would never open again. And under the wooden desk of the old office, between stacks of scattered files and a threadbare rug, lay Orion. Same eyes, not dulled, not older, no medals, no applause. Because for him, none of that had ever been a reward. They were a duty. The duty of a night watchman who had stood guard over a tiny heart until it found the road back. On the first snowfall of the next year, Elias brought Lila back to the backyard, where she had once watched woodpeckers and learned to draw constellations her mother taught her. Her hair had grown back, soft and thin as sunlight. She could not walk steadily yet, but she managed a few steps with crutches. And most important of all, she smiled. The snow blanketed the yard, ankle deep. Orion wandered at a distance, leaving tracks scattered like wandering thoughts. But then, just as Elias set up his camera to capture Lila's first winter alive again, the dog stopped. He didn't run. He didn't loop. He circled Lila slowly, once, then again, and stopped behind her, When Elias pressed the shutter, he thought it was just a photo of a little girl in the snow. But when he checked the screen, he froze. Orion's tracks were not random. They formed an arc, encircling Lila in the shape of an embrace. From the camera's angle, it appeared exactly as a heart. A heart of snow. No one asked for it. No one planned it. But it was there. The result of presence. Of someone who once stood guard over dreams, once called a soul back home. And now only needed to be close, to surround. 3 months later, that image became the official symbol of the Lila's Watch Foundation, an organization founded not to save sick children, but to protect one final moment. The moment when people usually say, "There's no hope," but something unseen has not yet let go. The foundation's first motto wasn't on its website. It was carved beneath the image itself. Do not turn off the light if the light has not left. Lila was a co-founder, though only 7 years old. Orion was the living emblem. Elias became executive director. And Silas, once convicted for striking a doctor who refused care, designed the entire intuitive response training model for support dogs. In its first year, Lila's Watch trained 11 child dog pairs. 4 of them demonstrated early detection of seizures or blood pressure shifts before medical equipment responded. 2 were tested in coma care rooms, where patients' brain activity increased in the presence of sustained animal contact. But for Elias, those achievements were not what mattered most. What mattered were the letters, from families who had once lost children, who had once been told to sign quickly, to ease the burden, who had once stopped asking for fear of being seen as delusional. Letters, handwritten and raw, arrived from all over. "My son didn't survive, but he opened his eyes once when the dog entered the room." "My granddaughter was unresponsive until she heard the soft tapping of claws from a Samoyed across the tile floor." "We couldn't keep her, but we kept the final image. She knew who was there, and she wasn't afraid." In a rare interview, when asked what had driven him to build the foundation, Elias answered simply, "Because I nearly buried a child who was still alive, and a dog, who could not speak, screamed at me." At the 1-year celebration of the foundation, Lila stood on a small stage with Orion beside her. She didn't say much. She simply raised a picture she had drawn herself. A girl in the snow, eyes closed. Beside her, a brown wax crayon dog wrapped around her in the shape of a heart. At the top of the page, she had written in blue ink, "I'm not afraid anymore, because I know someone is waiting for me to wake up." The hall fell silent. And in the farthest row, where no spotlight reached, Silas nodded quietly. Orion rested his head on Lila's foot. And Elias, for the first time since the day Claire died, felt something strange. Small, fragile, but certain. His heart was no longer missing a piece. Some stories do not need to be spoken loudly. They only need to be told through a single gaze, like the way Orion looked at Lila throughout their journey between life and death. And there are souls that do not carry words, but whose every action becomes a message of loyalty, of connection, and of healing. The German Shepherd, a breed often known for bravery, intelligence, and devotion, goes far beyond the image of a protector. In this story, Orion was not just a dog. He was the gatekeeper between life and death, the bridge between despair and a miracle. As Anatole France once wrote, "Until one has loved an animal, a part of one's soul remains unawakened." The story of Lila and Orion is a reminder that some beings cannot speak with words, but love with their whole hearts. And sometimes, those hearts are the only force strong enough to hold someone in this world when everything else has let go.